When it comes to the question whether social forces, economic forces or cultural forces drive populism, then the clear answer from today's discussion is that all three play a big role. And economic forces are important because they are very powerful in triggering populist sentiments. But cultural forces, for example, in Britain it was the idea of British exceptionalism, that these cultural forces, they have been there for a long time and they just were mobilized in the right moment of time. So basically it is an interaction of political, economic and cultural forces. There has always been a segment in the population that was skeptical about democracy, that was prone to lean towards authoritarian leaders, that was anti-immigrant, or that was maybe even racist. So these tendencies, they always exist in society. And it depends on certain triggers, whether they become virulent, whether they become really relevant. And two of these triggers in the current situation have been, when we look over the last 2 decades, is economic austerity, the increase in economic insecurity due to financial and economic crisis, but also the immigration shock. So these undercurrents, they're always there, but they need certain triggers, and economics is a powerful trigger. But then the triggers also come in the form of populist politicians who use powerful emotional language to further fire or put oil into the fire. So I think we always have had such populist undercurrents, and it just depends. They were always latently there, but whether they will become relevant in a specific political situation depends on these triggers. There are two components to the answer. One is there are legitimate concerns, there are legitimate populist concerns. For example, large segments of the working class have been neglected in the US. They have been kind of left by their own. There's no welfare state in the US that protects them from economic shocks. And now the people respond by, for example, voting for Trump, who claims to help them. So there is kind of, the legitimate aspect here is that some people are left behind and nobody in the political system cared for them, and that turns out to be a basis for populist movements. But then there is the other side of populism, which is the attack on democratic institutions, the authoritarian tendencies, the undermining of the checks and balances that we currently see in the US or in Viktor Orban's Hungary. So they basically, and these tendencies, they need to be, we need to fight against them. We need to do everything to prevent that, because they have very bad long-run consequences for these countries. There have been some very interesting statements in today's forum with regard to the question what can be done to constrain populist movements. And I think because populism partly reflects the neglect of certain interests in society, one obvious response is to take these interests more seriously. So to provide more economic security, to let people who don't participate in the gains from globalization participate in these gains. So that is one important policy response to populism. And this can be done through educational policies or through other cash transfer policies and so on. Another point is the anti-immigration stance of populist policies. Now, many populists, or many people who vote for populist parties, they are not necessarily completely against migration. They are not completely against immigration. they are against the speed with which immigration happens, and they are against the type of immigration that occurs. I mean, a good example is Switzerland. Switzerland has had traditionally been quite successful in attracting, at least during the last immigration wave, relatively skilled people. In the US, it's very different. It's a lot of unskilled immigration, unskilled workers come, and they threaten the jobs of other unskilled workers in the US. And so the type of immigration is also important, both in terms of skills the people have and in terms of the culture they bring with. And I think the countries may need to respond in some way by being more selective about the way in which they allow for immigration. So these are two concrete policies. So one could be, or another issue is addressing inequality. I mean, it's partly related to the question of who gains from globalization and who benefits from the gains from trade. But it goes beyond that, because particularly in the US more so than in Europe, economic inequality has grown quite a bit. And people resent that large amount of inequality. And this explains why we now also have on the left, on the democratic side, very far left-wing policies that are maybe not populist, but have some relations to populist movements.